The lightning split the Montana sky like God's own whip, and Cassidy Brewster knew his prize stallion was running straight into hell. Thunder rolled across the Broken Arrow Ranch as sheets of rain turned the drought-hardened earth into treacherous mud. Cassidy pulled his Stetson low and spurred his mare toward the fence line, where Tempest had jumped the rails an hour ago. The black stallion was worth more than the ranch's annual profit, but that wasn't why Cassidy's heart hammered against his ribs as he rode into the maelstrom. Tempest had been his daughter's horse. 18 years had passed since 12-year-old Marlowe vanished from the county fair, swallowed by a crowd that stretched into every parent's worst nightmare. 18 years since the FBI closed the case, since his wife Cordelia left him with nothing but divorce papers and accusations, since the ranch hands stopped meeting his eyes when they thought he wasn't looking. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, bending them nearly horizontal. Cassidy's mare, Juniper, fought against the gale as they crested the ridge overlooking Devil's Canyon. Below, the usually dry creek bed roared with rushing water, and somewhere in that chaos, he could hear the panicked whinnying of his horse. "Easy, girl," he murmured to Juniper, though his own hands trembled on the reins. The smart thing would be to wait for the storm to pass, but Tempest had been Marlowe's favorite, the gentle giant she'd whispered secrets to in the barn when she thought no one was listening. Losing that horse would be like losing her all over again. Lightning illuminated the canyon for a split second, and Cassidy's blood turned to ice water. There was Tempest, trapped on a narrow ledge halfway down the canyon wall, but the stallion wasn't alone. A figure in a bright yellow rain slicker stood beside the horse, one hand on the animal's neck, seemingly oblivious to the 30-foot drop below. "Hey!" Cassidy shouted into the wind, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Get away from there. That ledge won't hold." The figure looked up, and even through the driving rain, Cassidy could see a woman's face beneath the hood of the slicker. Young, maybe late 20s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to capture the lightning itself. She raised one hand not in greeting, but in a gesture that somehow conveyed both authority and reassurance. Then she did something that made Cassidy's breath catch in his throat. She began to sing. The melody was wordless, a haunting lullaby that somehow cut through the storm's fury. Tempest's ears pricked forward, his panicked movements slowing to a rhythmic sway that matched the woman's voice. Even the thunder seemed to quiet, as if the very storm was listening. Cassidy had heard that song before, 18 years ago, drifting from Marlowe's bedroom window on summer evenings when she thought the whole world was asleep. The same melody his daughter had hummed while brushing Tempest's coat, her small hands gentle on the young colt's muzzle. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, the storm, the canyon, even time itself seemed to stop. His lips moved soundlessly round a name he'd whispered into empty rooms for nearly 2 decades. Marlowe. The woman on the ledge froze mid-song, her hands still pressed against Tempest's neck. Even through the curtain of rain, Cassidy could see her shoulders stiffen at the sound of her name, her real name, the one that had been carved into his heart like initials on a tree. "No," she called back, but her voice cracked like thin ice. "You're mistaken." Cassidy urged Juniper closer to the canyon's edge, his weathered face a mask of desperate hope and 18 years of accumulated grief. The woman turned away, but not before he caught sight of something that made his world tilt on its axis. A crescent-shaped scar just above her left eyebrow, the same mark his daughter had carried since she'd fallen from the barn loft at age 7. "Marlowe Cordelia Brewster," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a father's unwavering certainty. "Born March 15th, 30 years ago next spring. You used to sing that song to calm the horses when storms rolled through." The woman's composure cracked completely. Her knees buckled, and she sank against Tempest's flank, the yellow rain slicker making her look like a broken sunflower against the dark stone. "How do you?" she began, then stopped, her eyes wide with something that might have been recognition or terror. "Because I'm your father," Cassidy said simply, "and I've been looking for you every day since you disappeared." Thunder crashed overhead, but the words hung between them in the sudden silence that follows revelation. The woman Marlowe shook her head violently, sending droplets flying from her hood. "My father died when I was 12, she said, but the certainty in her voice was already wavering. In a car accident. My mother told me. She stopped abruptly, as if catching herself before revealing too much. Cassidy felt his heart shatter and rebuild itself in the span of a heartbeat. Cordelia took you. She told you I was dead. It wasn't a question. The pieces were falling into place with the horrible clarity of truth finally revealed. Marlowe's breath came in short gasps, visible in the cold air despite the rain. She said you didn't want me, that you'd rather have your horses than a daughter. I sold half my herd to pay the search teams, Cassidy said quietly. Mortgaged the ranch to hire private investigators. Your mother knew I'd never stop looking. So she made sure I was looking in all the wrong places. The ledge beneath them groaned ominously, reminding both of them that their reunion was taking place in the most precarious of circumstances. Tempest shifted nervously, and small rocks tumbled into the roaring creek below. We need to get you both off that ledge, Cassidy said, forcing himself to focus on the immediate danger rather than the emotional maelstrom, threatening to overwhelm him. Can you climb up to me? Marlowe looked up at the steep canyon wall, then down at the churning water below. I can't leave him, she said, patting Tempest's neck. He's injured. That's why I was trying to. She gestured helplessly at the impossible situation. For the first time, Cassidy noticed the dark stain on Tempest's right foreleg, barely visible against his black coat. The stallion must have cut himself jumping the fence or scrambling down the canyon wall without immediate attention. The wound could become infected, potentially ending the horse's life. I have rope in my saddlebags, Cassidy called down. We can rig a pulley system. Get him up to solid ground. In the storm? Marlowe's voice held a note of professional skepticism that caught Cassidy off guard. The risk factors alone. You're a veterinarian, he realized suddenly. That's why you knew how to calm him, why you went down there in the first place. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Large animal specialty. I was driving through when I saw him jump the fence. Couldn't just leave him. She paused, studying Cassidy's face through the rain. Mama always said I got my stubborn streak from somewhere. The word mama hit Cassidy like a physical blow. 18 years of imagined conversations, of birthdays and graduations and wedding days he'd missed, compressed into that single, loaded syllable. Help me save him, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Then we'll figure out the rest. Working together in the howling storm, Cassidy and Marlowe became a team born of necessity and 16 years of shared instinct. Despite the chasm of time and deception between them, their movements synchronized with the natural rhythm of people who understood animals, weather, and the delicate balance between life and death. Cassidy rappelled down the canyon wall, his rope secured to Juniper's saddle horn. The mare stood steady as granite despite the lightning splitting the sky above them, a testament to years of trust between horse and rider. As he descended, Cassidy caught fragments of Marlowe's voice, professional, competent, utterly focused on Tempest's welfare. The laceration extends approximately 4 inches along the lateral aspect of the right foreleg. She was saying, more to herself than to him. No obvious signs of arterial involvement, but we'll need to irrigate thoroughly once we're topside. Her clinical detachment faltered when Cassidy landed on the narrow ledge beside her. Up close, the resemblance was unmistakable, not just the scar above her eyebrow, but the way she tilted her head when concentrating, the stubborn set of her jaw that had driven him to distraction when she was 12 and determined to train a wild Mustang. Against all common sense. You grew up beautiful, he said quietly, then immediately felt foolish for the inadequate words. Marlowe's hands stilled on Tempest's neck. I grew up believing my father was dead, she replied, but without the earlier venom. I grew up thinking he chose horses over his own daughter. Never, Cassidy said with quiet intensity. Not for 1 second of one day in 18 years. They worked in charged silence, rigging a makeshift harness round Tempest's chest and hindquarters. The stallion, perhaps sensing their shared purpose, stood remarkably still despite the precarious footing and his obvious pain. Marlowe's expertise showed in every movement, the way she positioned the ropes to avoid pressure points, how she monitored the horse's breathing and heart rate even as rain pelted them both. On 3, Cassidy called up to an imaginary audience, then realized his mistake. Who's handling the pulleys? I called my partner before I came down here, Marlowe said, adjusting a strap with practiced efficiency. Quinlan should be. As if summoned by her words, a voice echoed down from the canyon rim. Marlowe, what the hell are you doing down there? A second rope dropped beside Cassidy's, and moments later another figure began descending, a compact woman with silver-streaked auburn hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with animals. Dr. Quinlan Rawlings, the woman announced as she reached the ledge. And you must be the rancher with more courage than sense. She assessed the situation with sharp green eyes, taking in Cassidy, Marlowe, and the injured stallion in one comprehensive glance. Partner, you've outdone yourself this time. The word partner carried layers of meaning that Cassidy couldn't quite parse in the midst of crisis, but he caught the protective edge in Quinlan's voice when she looked at Marlowe. He's her father, Marlowe said simply. Quinlan's eyebrows shot up, but she was too professional to let surprise interfere with the emergency at hand. Well then, Daddy, I hope you're as good with pulleys as you are with dramatic timing. Together, the three of them orchestrated Tempest's rescue with the precision of a surgical team. Quinlan managed the ropes from above while Cassidy and Marlowe guided the stallion's ascent from below. The ledge crumbled away in chunks as they worked, stones splashing into the roaring creek 30 feet below. But somehow they maintained their precarious balance when Tempest finally stood on solid ground. Sides heaving but safe, Marlowe allowed herself a moment of pure relief. She pressed her face against the stallion's neck, and Cassidy saw his daughter as she'd been at 12, fearless, compassionate, utterly devoted to any creature in need. He'll need antibiotics, she said, straightening and becoming the professional veterinarian again. The wound should be sutured within the hour to prevent. My clinic's 20 minutes from here. Quinlan interrupted, assuming the storm doesn't wash out Highway 9, as they prepared to transport the injured horse. Lightning illuminated the canyon one final time, revealing the scope of their escape. The ledge where Marlowe had been standing was gone, claimed by the rushing water below. You could have died, Cassidy said, the full weight of what had almost happened settling on his shoulders. Marlowe looked at him steadily, rain streaming down her face. So could you, but you came anyway. You're my daughter, he said simply. I'll always come. For the first time in 18 years, something like hope flickered in her eyes. The storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving the Montana landscape scrubbed clean and gleaming under emerging stars. In Quinlan's veterinary clinic, Tempest stood sedated in the treatment bay while Marlowe worked with steady hands to clean and suture his wound. Cassidy watched from the doorway, marveling at his daughter's competence and fighting the urge to memorize every gesture, every expression, as if she might vanish again at any moment. 15 sutures, Marlowe announced, stripping off her latex gloves. He'll need restricted movement for 10 days, antibiotics twice daily, and follow-up care to monitor for infection. I'll handle his aftercare, Cassidy said quickly, unless you'd rather, if you're planning to stay in the area. He stumbled over the words, suddenly uncertain. 18 years was a lifetime. She had built a life without him, become a person he didn't know, formed relationships and loyalties that had nothing to do with the Broken Arrow Ranch or the father she'd believed was dead. Quinlan saved him from further awkwardness by appearing in the doorway with 3 steaming mugs. Coffee, Irish style, she announced. Figured we could all use something to warm the bones. They settled in the clinic's small break room, an awkward triangle of people connected by circumstance and blood and 18 years of separation. Marlowe cradled her mug like a talisman, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from the dark surface. Tell me about her, Cassidy said finally, about Cordelia, about what happened after she kidnapped me. Marlowe's voice was steady, but Cassidy caught the tremor in her hands. She changed our names, became Corinne Dalton, made me Melody. We moved every 2 years, Nevada, Oregon, California. She always said it was because of her work, that she was a freelance consultant who needed to travel. What kind of consulting? Quinlan asked gently. I never really knew. She was always vague about it, said it was boring accounting stuff that wouldn't interest me. Marlowe took a sip of the Irish coffee and grimaced slightly. I realize now she was probably moving us around to stay ahead of anyone who might be looking. Cassidy felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. She made you believe I was dead. Made you mourn a father who was looking for you every damn day. She showed me newspaper clippings, Marlowe said quietly. An obituary from the Helena Independent record. Cassidy Brewster, 42, died in a single-vehicle accident on Highway 12. Survived by his wife Cordelia and daughter Marlowe. The clinical precision with which she recited the fake obituary hit Cassidy like a physical blow. Cordelia had planned every detail, crafted an alternate reality so complete that their daughter had no reason to question it. I kept the clipping. For years, Marlowe continued, until I started veterinary school and began to understand how easy it would be to fabricate something like that. By then, she was dying of pancreatic cancer, and I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I told myself it didn't matter anymore, you were dead either way. When did she die? Cassidy asked. 3 years ago. I was finishing my residency at UC Davis. Marlowe's voice caught slightly. She made me promise to scatter her ashes in Montana. Said it was where she'd been happiest. I've been driving around the state for 2 weeks, trying to find the right place. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Cordelia had brought her daughter home even in death, perhaps knowing that Marlowe would eventually find her way back to the truth. Quinlan cleared her throat diplomatically. I should probably mention that Marlowe and I have been together for years, she said, her hand finding Marlowe's across the small table. Professionally and personally, we run a mobile veterinary service together, large animals, ranch calls, emergency response. Cassidy absorbed this information with the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned not to take anything for granted. His daughter was gay, had a partner, had built a life he knew nothing about, but she was alive, sitting 3 feet away from him, real and breathing, and no longer the 12-year-old girl frozen in his memory. Are you happy? He asked. The question seemed to catch Marlowe off guard. Yes, I think so. We do good work. Help animals, make a difference. Then I'm happy too, Cassidy said simply. Quinlan squeezed Marlowe's hand. He's nothing like you described him, she said. How did she describe me? Cassidy asked. Though he wasn't sure he wanted to know, Marlowe looked uncomfortable. She said you were cold, distant, that you cared more about your horses than people, that you married her because she was convenient and had me because you needed an heir for the ranch. She paused, studying his face. She said you never told her you loved her, not once in 15 years of marriage. I told her every morning for the first 5 years, Cassidy said quietly, until she asked me to stop because it was getting old. I told her the night you disappeared, when the FBI agent asked if there was anyone who might want to hurt our family. I begged her not to leave, promised we'd work through whatever was broken between us. He met Marlowe's eyes. And I told her I loved her in the divorce papers she served me 6 months later, when she claimed I was an unfit father, who'd rather search for a dead child than accept reality and move on. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of truth finally spoken. Dawn painted the Montana sky in shades of rose and gold as Cassidy led Tempest into the barn, the stallion moving gingerly but steadily on 3 legs. Marlowe and Quinlan followed, their truck loaded with veterinary equipment and the few possessions they'd accumulated during 2 weeks of wandering the state. He'll heal clean, Marlowe said, running professional hands over Tempest's sutured wound. You've got good facilities here, proper ventilation, clean stalls. She paused, looking around the barn with something that might have been nostalgia. It's smaller than I remembered. You were smaller too, Cassidy pointed out. Everything seems bigger when you're 12. The barn held ghosts of memory, the stall where Marlowe had nursed an orphan foal, the loft where she'd fallen and earned her crescent scar, the tack room where she'd hidden when thunderstorms made her afraid. Cassidy watched his daughter move through these spaces with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile past and present, memory and reality. Quinlan busied herself examining the other horses, giving father and daughter space to navigate their tentative reconnection. Her professional assessment was thorough but unobtrusive, and Cassidy found himself grateful for her diplomacy. Whatever relationship Marlowe had built with this woman, it was clearly founded on mutual respect and genuine affection. "The ranch has changed," Marlowe observed, standing in the doorway and looking out at the pastures where cattle grazed in the morning light. "Had to diversify after you. After I spent everything on the search," Cassidy explained. "Cattle operation. Now, some guest ranching in the summer. The horses are mostly for the dude ranch guests. Except for Tempest and a few others, you kept him all these years, even when you needed money." "He was yours," Cassidy said simply. "Seemed wrong to sell him when you might come home someday." Marlowe's composure cracked slightly. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be your daughter again. You never stopped being my daughter," Cassidy replied. "Even when I thought you were dead. Even when the whole world told me to give up, you were still my little girl. Nothing can change that, not time, not distance, not even your mother's lies." They walked toward the house in comfortable silence. Three people trying to figure out how to become a family. The ranch hands were already at work in the distant fields, and smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. Signs of the life that had continued in Marlowe's absence. "I used to dream about this place," Marlowe admitted as they climbed the porch steps. "Especially after Cordelia died. I'd dream about riding Tempest through the pastures, about helping with the roundup, about sitting on this porch, watching thunderstorms roll across the valley." The front door stuck slightly, swollen from the previous night's rain, and Cassidy had to put his shoulder into it. The house beyond was neat but sparse, decorated with the functional simplicity of a man who'd lived alone for too long. Photos of Marlowe at various ages lined the mantelpiece, a shrine to the daughter who'd never grown older in his mind. "You kept everything," Marlowe breathed, touching the frame of her fifth-grade school picture. "I kept hoping," Cassidy corrected. Quinlan cleared her throat from the doorway. "I should probably head into town, find us a motel room," she said tactfully. "Give you some time to catch up." "Nonsense," Cassidy said quickly. "Guest room's made up, and there's a perfectly good couch if you don't mind sharing space with an old rancher who snores. We couldn't impose," Quinlan began. "You're not imposing. Your family," Cassidy said, then caught himself. "I mean, if that's, I don't want to presume." "Family," Marlowe said quietly, testing the word. "I haven't had much of that since Cordelia died." They spent the morning talking, filling in 18 years of separation with the broad strokes of lived experience. Marlowe spoke of veterinary school, of her partnership with Quinlan, of the mobile practice that had taken them across 3 states. Cassidy shared stories of the ranch, of the investigators he'd hired, of the nights he'd ridden out to the canyon just to hear the echo of his own voice calling her name. "I never remarried," he said when Marlowe asked about the absence of feminine touches in the house. "Couldn't see the point. Everything I loved was already gone." "I'm not gone anymore," she said. "No," he agreed, looking at his daughter, 30 years old, professional, competent. Nothing like the child he'd lost, but everything he'd hoped she might become. "You're not." Quinlan found them there an hour later, father and daughter sitting on the porch swing Cassidy had built the summer before Marlowe disappeared, talking quietly as the sun climbed toward noon. The cattle lowed in the distance, Tempest nickered from the barn, and somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. "So," Quinlan said, settling into a wooden chair with her coffee, "what's the plan?" 6 months later, the Broken Arrow Ranch bore the unmistakable signs of renewal. A new sign hung by the main gate, Brewster and Rawlings Mobile Veterinary Services serving central Montana. The old guest cabins had been converted into a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, complete with surgical suite and recovery stalls. In the main barn, Tempest stood in his stall, fully healed, watching with intelligent eyes as Marlowe examined a mare heavy with foal. "She'll drop that baby any day now," Marlowe announced, stripping off her examination gloves. "Maybe tonight, definitely within the week." The mare's owner, a weathered rancher named Jonas Whitehorse, nodded approvingly. "You're as good as old Doc Morrison ever was," he said. "Maybe better. That horse trusts you." Something fierce, trust, had become the cornerstone of Marlowe's return to Montana. Word had spread quickly through the tight-knit ranching community about Cassidy Brewster's daughter, the one who'd been missing for 18 years, the one who'd become a veterinarian and come home at last. There had been skeptics at first, people who remembered the search, the speculation, the gradual acceptance that the little girl was probably dead. But skepticism had given way to respect as Marlowe proved her competence. With one difficult case after another, Cassidy emerged from the house carrying a thermos of coffee and a plate of Quinlan's famous chocolate chip cookies. At 64, he moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned not to take anything for granted. But there was a lightness to his step that hadn't been there in decades. "Quinlan's on a call over at the Morrison place," he reported. "Sick calf, probably scours, said she'd be back by supper." The three of them had settled into an easy domestic rhythm over the months. Marlowe and Quinlan shared the renovated foreman's house, while Cassidy kept the main house but took most of his meals with them. It was an arrangement that honored both independence and connection, allowing them to rebuild relationships without the pressure of forced intimacy. "Dad," Marlowe said, the word still carrying a note of wonder even after months of practice. "I've been thinking about something." Cassidy settled on a hay bale, giving her his full attention. The casual use of Dad still sent a warm shock through his system every time. A reminder of what he'd feared was lost forever. "I want to change my name back," she continued. "Legally, I mean." From Melody Dalton to Marlowe Brewster, it feels like the last step, you know? Really coming home. The thermos slipped in Cassidy's hands, and he had to catch it before it hit the ground. "Are you sure? I mean, you've been Melody for 18 years. Your veterinary license, your practice, everything's in that name. That's just paperwork," Marlowe said firmly. "Melody Dalton was someone I had to be to survive. But I'm ready to be who I really am again." Before Cassidy could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main pasture. Shouts and the thundering of hooves announced some kind of emergency, and all three of them rushed toward the sound. They found two ranch hands trying to corner a young bull that had somehow gotten tangled in barbed wire, the animal's panic making rescue attempts increasingly dangerous. "He's going to hurt himself worse if we can't calm him down," one of the hens called out. Without hesitation, Marlowe began to sing the same wordless lullaby she'd used to calm Tempest in the Canyon 6 months ago. The bull's ears pricked forward, his frantic movements slowing to an uncertain shuffle. As her voice rose and fell in the ancient melody, the animal gradually settled, allowing the men to approach and carefully cut away the wire. "Damn," Jonas Whitehorse breathed. "Never seen anything like that. It's like you speak their language." "She always could," Cassidy said proudly. "Even when she was little, she had a way with animals that was pure magic." As they walked back toward the barn, Marlowe slipped her arm through her father's, a gesture that had become natural over the months, but still filled him with quiet joy. "You know what the best part is," she said. "I remember now, not just the bad parts, not just the fear and confusion of being taken. I remember the good parts, to riding with you in the mornings, helping with the foaling, singing to the horses during storms. Those were good times," Cassidy agreed. "Some of the best of my life." "Mine too," she said. "And now we get to make new ones." That evening, as the sun set over the Broken Arrow Ranch, three figures sat on the porch of the main house, watching the last light fade from the Montana sky. Quinlan had returned from her call with stories of successful treatment and grateful ranchers. Marlowe leaned against her father's shoulder, finally comfortable with the physical affection she'd been afraid to trust for so long. "I scattered her ashes yesterday," Marlowe said suddenly. "Cordelia's ashes, up on Eagle Ridge, overlooking the valley." Cassidy was quiet for a long moment, despite everything, the lies, the theft of his daughter, the 18 years of grief. He found he couldn't quite hate his ex-wife. She'd been broken too, in her own way, driven by demons he'd never fully understood. "She brought you home in the end," he said finally. "Maybe that counts for something. Maybe." Marlowe agreed. "But I'm not here because of her. I'm here because..." A lonely rancher rode into a storm to save his horse, and found something infinitely more precious instead. Quinlan chuckled. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said about our first meeting." "Well," Marlowe said, grinning, "I was hanging off a cliff in a thunderstorm. Romance wasn't exactly my priority." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, cattle settling for the night, horses moving in their stalls. the distant call of a coyote from the ridgeline. It was the sound of home, of family, of second chances and dreams fulfilled against all odds. The lonely rancher wasn't lonely anymore. His daughter had come home at last, bringing with her a future bright with possibility and a love that had survived 18 years of separation. And in the morning, they would wake up and tend to their animals, serve their community, and build the kind of life that honors both memory and hope.